All right, so to get started with installing Angular 5, you're going to need a couple prerequisites, and that is Node.js with the Node Package Manager, otherwise known as the NPM. Now, the reason we need this is because we're going to use it to install the Angular Command Line Interface, or CLI, to help us get started in installing a new Angular 5 project. Oh, but real quick, before we begin, make sure you check out my site, coursetro.com, where you're going to find a bunch of courses on modern design and development. A lot are free, and the others you can access for the cost of buying me like a 6-pack each month. That's it. Now, also, it probably wouldn't hurt to subscribe here on YouTube, and be sure to make sure the notifications are turned on. All right, let's get back to it. All right, so I'm going to switch to the desktop and open up your command line or console. I'm using a console emulator called Commander. This is for Windows. You can just go to Google and type it. It's free. And I'm going to first check to see whether or not we have Node.js installed. Node-v, yes, obviously I do. But if either of these commands go unrecognized for you, then head on over to nodejs.org and click on downloads, and then download the suitable installer based on your operating system, install it all the way through the default options, which will include the Node Package Manager, and then reload your console and then rerun these, and you'll find that they provide you with version numbers. Okay, so now we're going to install Angular 5, like I mentioned, through the command line interface. All right, so what we'll do is first we have to install it. So npm install @angular /CLI, and then add the -g for global flag, and that will install it on your machine as a whole. So if you hit enter, it will install it, and I've already had it installed, so I don't need to do that. And once it's done, installing, just type in mg-v. All right, and that will give you the current version number right here. Okay, so to get started, to create a new project, by the way, before I get there, if you just type in ng, it's going to give you a ton of options that you can use. So we're going to start a new project now. Ng new. Oh, by the way, make sure you hop into your code folder if you have one. All right, ng new. I'm going to call this ng5 for the name of the project. I'm also going to specify a style flag equals SCSS for Sass. And then also we want routing to be integrated and set up for us by default. So once we do this, it will run through for a little bit, and I'm just going to pause until it finishes. Really, it doesn't take more than 30 to 60 seconds. All right, so now it's finished. Now all we have to do is cd or hop into it. So cd and then the folder name, ng5. And now we can run ngserve. And it will take just a little bit of time while it builds out the project. And notice it says localhost 4200 is where the dev server will be accessible. And I will bring up a new browser window to get there. And there we have it. That is our Angular 5 app that is now set up and ready to go in the browser. And you can also open up your code editor. I'm going to off screen real quick, open up the new folder. All right, and here we go. We have the project structure all set up. And in the next lesson, or the next section of this course, we're going to go ahead and take an in-depth look at what Angular 5 components are. Hey everyone, Gary Simon of Coursetro, and today we're going to take a look at what Angular 5 components are. Now you can think of components as just being the basic building blocks of your Angular 5 application. So if I switch over to the desktop, we have our new Angular 5 project open. I'm using Visual Studio Code, and for the most part, you're going to be working within the source app folder when you're developing your Angular 5 application. Now, by default, the Angular command line interface, when it generates this project, will create a single component for you, and that is an app.component.ts for TypeScript. So when you're thinking about components, you can really think of them as being structured in 3 different sections. So first up here, we have our imports. Right now, we're only importing one, which is just a component from the Angular core library. And then in here is the component decorator. And this allows you to specify different properties that help define the structure of your component. So we have a selector, which shows app root. We'll get to that for us in a second. We also have a template URL. This allows you to define where the actual HTML template will be located. And then style URL. This is again, because we defined, we set up our project to work with Sass. We have our CSS extension. And then finally, the third section is just the export class component. This is where all of the logic resides for your Angular 5 application. All right, so how do we actually create a new component? Well, you can use the Angular CLI, which makes that quick and easy. So we're going to go back here, and right now we have our ngserve command running. We want to leave this up so we don't have to keep on running that command. So I'm going to open up a new console. All right, and the way we generate a new component is very simple. So what we'll do is type in ng generate, and what is it that we want to generate? Well, a component, and we're going to name it home. All right, it'll just take a couple seconds, and it tells you which files it creates and also if it updates anything. All right, let's go ahead and generate one more for our project. ng. We can also use a shorthand syntax, G for generate, C for component, and then this time we'll name this one about. All right, great. So let's go back, and we can now see we have two new folders in here, and these are based on the name that you specified when using the CLI. And each one has a component file. It has a Sass file and an HTML template. All right, so let's talk about nesting a component. So we now have two additional components. So let's look at how we can nest our home component into the base app component down here. So what we want to do is open up our app component.html. Now notice all of this HTML right here. This coincides with what is currently showing up right here. So we want to remove all of that. All right, we're going to leave the router outlet at the bottom just for now. And I'll tell you what that is a little bit later on. What we want to do is put in an unordered list. We're going to put kind of like a very simple navigation right here. Router link is a directive that you use that will allow you to basically change the actual component. So we'll say home. We'll get to that, by the way, in the routing lesson. I'm going to change this to about, and this will be about. All right, so the way we actually nest a component, if I come over here real quickly and we go to about, and we look at the about component, we'll see the selector is app-about. So the way we nest it is if we go back to our app component, we simply put in app-home, just like that. And you'll see the same pattern if we go to our app component. This is called app root. Well, there's also an index.html, and we can see app root right here. All right, so let's go ahead back and just save whatever we need to save here. All right, great. So that is the very basics of how components work and how they're structured and how you can nest them. In the next section, we're going to take a look at templating and styling in our Angular 5 app. Hey everyone, Gary Simon of Coursetro. Let's take a look at Angular 5 templating and styling. So going back, let's open up our home component TypeScript file right here. I'm going to hit Control B here in Visual Studio Code just to get rid of that sidebar. Okay, so when it comes to defining a template, we'll see by default we have the template URL property, and the value is associated with our home component HTML. And this simply allows you to designate an external template file, which helps kind of keep things separated and organized so that you don't have all of your HTML stuck in your component file. However, you do have the option, for instance, if you have a really small amount of template code, well, you can just change this here to template, and we could put in multi-line HTML if we use backticks, which is usually to the left of the number 1 key. And inside of here, we can then put, for instance, this is my HTML. And if we save it and go back to our project, we'll see it says this is my HTML. But we're not going to do that. I did want to show you that possibility, so I'm going to back up. All right. Now, when it comes to styling, you'll see that we have the same sort of ability, but we'll get to that in a second. I want to actually write some HTML for a basic app that we're going to be working on here in our home component HTML file. So to do that, I'm going to put in a div class, container, color-dark. And by the way, this is all going to be custom CSS. I'm not using any type of front-end framework like Bootstrap or anything. And don't worry, there's not too much HTML here at all. So just hang with me. We have a div class of call and then a p element. And this will be add a bucket list item. So our app, once again, is going to be based on just saving bucket list goals or something like that. All right, and then this one is going to say your bucket list. All right, and then we'll have another div class of container. This is going to be color light. And in this column, we're going to put in a p class of sm for small text. Use this form below to add a new bucket list goal. What do you want to do with your life? Okay. Now after that, we're going to have a form, a very simple form, mind you. And this will be just a form element here with an input type of text, a class of txt, a name of item, and a placeholder of life goal. Next, we'll have one more. Input type is a submit, a class of btn for button, and a value of add item. And then finally down here, we're just about finished. We'll put in a p class of life-container. And inside of here, just temporarily, I'm going to hard code a single life goal or bucket list goal. I want to climb a mountain. Okay. In the future, we will make this dynamic. Okay, so we'll go ahead and save that. And what we want to do now is talk a little bit about the CSS. So we're going to talk about styling here. So of course, we have the same sort of setup here. We have style URLs where we can define the CSS files that are associated with this component. Now, once again, you can write inline CSS just by changing this value to styles. We leave the brackets. We put in backticks. So we'll put one here and here. And then we can define our CSS as needed, like p font weight is bold, and then div color is gray. And so if we save this, you'll see the new result. We have our gray text and all that. Once again, though, we don't want that. We want to keep things nice and separated. So let's hop into this Sass file, and you can see there's nothing here by default. All right, so we're going to go ahead and before we get to this home component right here, I do want to step into, there is another file called styles, and this is where you can add global styles that will apply to pretty much all of your templates. So in here, I'm going to paste just a few quick rule sets. Okay, so first I'm importing a Google font called Railway with weights of 300 and 700. Next, in the body, I'm just changing the background, giving it some padding, a font family of Railway, and color, making the font white. We have an unordered list, which we created earlier, and just some basic rule sets, change the padding and margin, and then just other, very simple type of CSS rule sets right here. So save that, and then go back to your home component Sass file, and we have some more rule sets that I'm not going to type out by hand. I will just quickly overview these. All right, so first up here we have a container. We're actually using the new display, the CSS grid for defining our layout, which is an improvement over CSS Flexbox. And this is another property that's associated with the grid. And this helps us just basically to define our layout. So also we have our call, we have our color dark and light, our inputs, we're styling these just to make them look better. And then finally our what's called life container div. So if I save this and go back to the browser, we'll see that this does not work because I forgot to change back this property, style URL, plural. There we go. So now if we save, we'll go back and there we go. All right, great. So now going forward in the next section, we're going to take a look at property and event binding along with interpolation. I'll see you then. Hey everyone, Gary Simon of Coursetro, and in the previous lesson, we set up a template with some basic styling, and let's go see if we can actually make it function. So if I show you the result in the browser, we can see right now nothing is going to work. So the way that we can start to make this more interactive is through interpolation, property binding, and event binding. So let's talk about what interpolation is first. So let's go back to our project and let's go to we have our home component file right here. So interpolation is used for the purpose of, whenever you need to communicate properties that are defined here in our component class, then we use interpolation in the template to display those values or those properties. So just to give you a demonstration, we'll come just right up here and we're going to create a property called item count. It's going to be a number and we're going to set it to 4 initially. All right, so we'll save that and we'll go to our home component HTML, and notice where it says your bucket list. Let's change this, or add to it rather, a parentheses, and then inside of it we're going to use interpolation to display the item count value. So interpolation works by designating double curly brackets like that, and then the name of the property. All right, very simple. So let's save that. And there we go. We can see it now says 4. Of course, we're going to change this to be dynamic a little bit later. All right, so let's also talk about property binding. So let's say for some reason that we want to use the component class right here in this section to control the value of our add item button text. So if we go back, we could see that it says add item. Let's say for some reason we want to control the actual value property. So the way we can do that, we'll set up a new property called btn text, a type string, and we'll set it to add an item. Right now it says add item. Save that. We'll go back to our home component HTML, and right here where it says value, we can use interpolation btn text. So we'll save that. We go back, we can see that works. Now, property binding works very similarly. So we can see we have a property here called value. Well, what we can actually do is change this and wrap it in brackets, which is how you define a property binding. And then we don't have to have the squiggly brackets anymore. So we save that and we'll see that the result is the same. Okay, so let's also talk about two-way data binding, because this right here, when it comes to both property binding and interpolation, it's only one direction. It's going from the component to the template. But we can also create what's called two-way data binding. So going back to our project here, what if we wanted to use our input text field right here to both retrieve and set its value from a component class? Well, we can use what's called the ng model to create that two-way data binding. So in order for this to work and have access to ng model, we have to import the forms module. Okay, so to do that, we're going to come to our app module.ts right here, and we're going to add the following line. I'm just going to put this here at the top. So import forms module from the Angular forms library, and then we add it to the imports property here, or array rather. So we'll save that, and we'll go back to our home component file, and we're going to add in another property called goal text, and we're going to set it to a string and initially my first life goal. All right, so this is where it's going to go from the component to the component HTML template. So now we'll go to our HTML, and where it says right here, we're going to add one thing at the very end. And the way you set up the two-way data binding is by specifying a bracket, and then inside of the brackets are the parentheses. ng model equals goal text. Now let's also just temporarily underneath it, we'll add a br and a span, and we're going to put in the goal text through interpolation. So let's save that. Okay, now we could see we have my first life goal. This is coming from the one direction in terms of going from the component to this HTML template. And then we can also see it's doing the same thing down here. Now if I start editing this text, we can now see it's working in the reverse direction, because this right here is coming from the component class, yet it's being set based on the value right here. And so that's how two-way data binding works. Now let's also talk about event binding. So we know how to capture user input, as we just demonstrated right here, and communicate it to our class. So how can we make our add an item button actually work and save the user submitted data somewhere? So that's where event binding comes in. We can use event binding to capture a variety of user initiated events to initiate logic in our component class. So Angular 5 does support a lot of different types of events, but we're going to use a click event. So let's come over here, and we can get rid of this, by the way. And when it comes to our input submit button, we're going to add a click event. So when it comes to click events, you define them by wrapping them in parentheses. So we put in a click, which is a type of event, and then we'll call a method called add item. We don't actually have to pass in any type of value here within the argument, because this is already being saved in our component class. All right, so let's go ahead and save this and go back to our component. And we're going to define a array. It's going to be goals equals array. All right, now when it comes to this ng on init, this is a lifecycle hook, which is initiated when the app loads or the component itself loads. So any code in here will get ran when the component is loaded. So we're going to say this dot first item count. We're going to make that dynamic. This dot goals dot length. All right. So we can also just get rid of this. And then we're going to create our add item method down here. So we're going to say this dot goals dot push this goal text, and then this dot goal text, we're going to clear out the input after it's submitted, and then this dot item count equals this dot goals dot length. Okay, so we'll save that. And let's go back to our project here. All right, my first life goal. Now you can see it says 0 because we have this default one added. Now you can see it keeps on counting as we add new items. Now it's not getting shown here because we haven't actually coded for that. So what we want to do is use what's called ng4 to iterate through this array in the template. Okay, so let's go back to our template. And where it says I want to climb a mountain, we'll get rid of that. And just after the class, we're going to put in asterisk ng4 equals let goal of goals. Then we simply reference goal through interpolation. So we'll save that. All right, so let's go ahead and add an item. And awesome. Okay, so now you can play around with this if you want. Obviously, not much functionality at this point, but going forward, we're going to take now a look at animation in Angular 5 and see what it would take to animate these in and out. All right, I'll see you then. Hey everyone, Gary Simon of Coursetro. Let's go ahead and take a look at Angular 5 animation by continuing on with the project that we've been working on throughout this course. So it would be really cool, for instance, if we could animate each one of these items as they get added. So if I add a new life goal, we could see there's no animation that really takes place. So to get started with Angular animation in Angular 5, we have to go to our console and we have to install or import the Angular animations library. So npm install Angular animations, we'll see at latest, and then we'll save it as a development dependency. So this will take just a little bit of time. Okay, now if this issue happens with you where it says operation not permitted, what we can do is open up a new Commander window or your console, run it as administrator, ng5, npm install at Angular animations at latest, and we'll save it. All right, great, it worked this time. So let's go ahead and go back to our project, and we have to go to the app module because we just installed it. However, we need to add it to our module here. So the way we do that is we add an import. So it's import browser animations module from the Angular platform browser animations library, and then we take this and we add it as an import. All right, so we'll save that. Now we want to actually import the animation to the given component from which we want to add the animations to. So we go to our home component, and up here, just under our first import, we're going to import a number of animation-specific functions. So we're going to import trigger, style, transition, animate keyframes, query, and stagger from Angular animations. Okay, so next, the area in which you define your animations resides within the component decorator as another property called animations. So we're going to add a comma here, animations, and then our animations go within here. Okay. So the first animation specific function that we use to set up an animation is called trigger. So we put in trigger, and the first argument accepts the name of the animation. We're going to call this goals. Next, we put in an array. All right, so this is where a number of different animation specific functions will reside. Okay, so let's go ahead and next we're going to specify a transition. And we're going to say in the first argument, any by wildcard to any. So this transition will get activated when pretty much any state goes to any state. And then in here, in the second argument, we open up another array, and we're going to use query. So query is another animation specific function where we can say in the first argument, when something enters the DOM, then we'll say style. The opacity will be 0. And then we'll put in optional true right here. And sometimes the animations will fail if you don't add this optional true. All right, and then we're going to put in another one, another query with the same thing, enter, and we're going to stagger. And stagger basically is a function that allows you to take a number of elements in the DOM, like our list, for instance, and the delay that you set up, which in our case is 300 milliseconds, will place a delay on when each subsequent DOM element will start to animate. So it creates a staggering animation of sorts, as the name would imply. So after here, in the first argument, we put a comma, and then we open up an array. And this, by the way, is getting really annoying. So I'm going to change that real quick. I'm going to go to Preferences and Settings. All right. Okay, so now I'm going to go back. I'm going to increase my size. Okay, so in here, we're going to use the animate function. And we'll say at 0.6 seconds ease in. And then we're going to use keyframes animations, which this is not required. I'm kind of throwing everything at you right now just to show you the full capabilities. Inside of keyframes, it accepts a number of style functions. So the first one will be style of opacity 0. Transform will be translate Y at negative 75%. So they're going to come from the top. And then we're going to put offset 0. So that's its starting position. So let's go ahead, copy this, and we'll paste it twice, and we'll just change these values up. This will be 0.5. So this is going to happen at the middle of this 0.6 seconds duration for animation. This will be actually 0.3 rather. And this will be 1. This is at the end of the animation. This opacity will be 1. And I just realized I didn't have a closing parentheses there. This one for translate Y, it's actually going to go further by 35 pixels from its default position. And then right here, it will be 0. Okay. That looks pretty good right there for me. We also want to add, after this point where we have our all of these closing brackets and parentheses, we're going to add an optional true right here. So I'm going to copy this, and we're going to put it right here. All right. So let's go ahead and save that. I know this is probably very confusing at this point, but you'll see kind of how it's all is deconstructed once we take a look at the result. So my first life goal, oh, that's right. We have to actually have to add it to our template. So the second step, of course, once we define the animations, we're going to apply the animations in the template. So real quickly, we're going to come to our home component, and where it says div class container light, we're going to add at goals, and that's the name of the animation trigger, goals.length. All right, we have an issue here. Yep, let's fix that. There we go. Okay, so real quickly, just so we have some initial values to work with for our goals array, let's come back here, and I'm going to just paste in 3 different values. So my first life goal, I want to climb a mountain, go ice skating. So if we save it, we go back, there we go. Let me refresh that one more time. And there you go. That is a stagger animation along with multi-step animation through the keyframes property. And as you can see, it looks really cool. Let's try adding another one. And of course, if we leave it blank, we're not doing any type of checks right now. But there you go. All right, so let's also make this remove actual elements when we click on them, on these little goals. So to do that, we're going to use, once again, click event binding. So what we'll do is right where we have let go of goals right after, we're going to put in on click, remove item, and we're going to pass in an index of called I. So we have to update this, let I equal index. All right, so we'll save that. Oops, I'm going to make sure I didn't put a closing quote there. We're going to go back to our home component, and now we have to define that remove item method. And we'll put in here our I, and we'll simply say that this goals.splice, this is all just typical JavaScript, I in 1. All right, so then in order for it to actually animate back out, we have to add another query. And this time, don't worry, it'll be a bit easier to work with. So we're going to put a comma after this. We're going to copy this one. All right. And this is going to be leave. So when anything leaves the DOM, then we can change just these values. We're going to reverse them basically. So this is going to be 1. This will be 0 because it's starting at position 0. And then we have our opacity is same here. This changes to 0. And then this right here gets changed to negative 75%. So we're just flipping everything essentially. So we'll save that. All right, so let's click on one, and there you go. Awesome stuff. So as you can see, the animation library and capabilities of Angular 5 are really, really powerful. And while we just kind of scratched the surface, I did kind of throw everything at you in terms of the potential capabilities of animation. So of course, a lot of them can be a lot more simple than what we just did. So I definitely suggest experimenting with them. All right, so in the next lesson, we're going to take a look at the Angular 5 router. Hey everyone, Gary Simon of Coursetro. In this lesson, we're going to take a look at the Angular 5 router. All right, so in our project right now, we do have two different components. So we have the home component and about component. Now, if I get out the inspector in the console and I click on about, you'll see that it errors. So let's actually make this work so that it will transition between what's displayed here in the home component template and then also what's displayed here in this section when about is clicked. Okay, so when we started this project with the CLI or the command line interface tool, we added the -- routing flag, and this sets up this file right here, app routing module. So the first thing we have to do is import the components that we want to set up routing for. So in our case, we have two different components. We have home component, so we're importing home component from home component, and we don't have to add the .ts extension. It will do that for us. And then also our about component from about component. All right, next, this is where inside of this little array here is where we set up our paths. So let's open this up, and we're going to put in an object with the first property being path, and this is going to be the home path, so we're not putting anything inside of the value. And then the component is home component. Very, very easy. So now we can add a comma here. Let's copy this and paste that. This one is going to be, the path will be in the actual address bar, the URL is going to be about, and this will be about component. Okay, very, very simple. So now if we actually look at the project, we're going to see two of them. Well, the reason that is because we have to go back to our home, or rather our app component HTML, and we can get rid of this selector right here. So now if we save this, we'll go back And yay, it works. Awesome. Okay, so let's also talk about what it takes to set and fetch Angular 5 route parameters. So while we don't need any type of query parameters for our particular project, we're going to create one just so that I can show you how you can work in parameters to your URLs and retrieve the values if you need to. So let's visit our app routing module file once again. And right for our path for about, we're going to add /ID. All right, so this ID here is what's called a route parameter. So you can, of course, for instance, create multiple route parameters called whatever and etc. But we're just going to do one for this purpose. So let's save that. And let's go back to our app component file here. We're going to just put in, we're going to hard code a value. This would normally come, obviously, perhaps something from like a database value for a specific item or entry, but we're just going to hard code it for now. Okay, so now if we save this and we go, we'll see, of course, that it will work. But how do we actually retrieve this value right here in the component class? All right, well, let's go ahead back real quick. We'll go to our about component. All right, we haven't worked in here yet, but what we want to do is add in just one single import, and that will be activated route from the Angular router library. All right, so this will give us access to the route parameters. So next we have to create an instance of activated route. And we do that through what's called dependency injection, and that happens within the constructor right here. So the way you do that is private, we'll name it route, and then activated route. Then inside of here in the constructor, and this gets called again when the component is loaded, we're going to say this dot route dot params dot subscribe. We're going to take the response and we're simply going to console log the response.id because that's the name of the route ID that we defined in the app routing module. All right. So now if we go ahead and save this, we can now see it says in our console, if you Control-Shift-I here in Chrome, go to console, you'll see it says 48. So now we can actually fetch the route parameters in our component class. And ordinarily you would set a property up here and then bind the property to this value and then go do something like, for instance, you would query an API to get a specific item from a database. All right, so let's also talk about another topic, which is component-based router navigation. So sometimes you may need to change the router outlet component based on logic occurring in a component class, for instance. So in this case, let's import router from the Angular router library at the top. All right. Now, once again, we have to create an instance of router through dependency injection. So I'm going to simply copy and paste that real quick. Private router set to router. And then we're going to create a custom method, send me home. And we'll say this.router.navigate. And it accepts here in array, we'll say just empty. And this is really corresponding to the path right here. So we want them to go to the home component, so we'll set it to the path right there. All right, so let's save this. And then next we open up the about component template. And I'm just going to real quickly paste in a value right here. So all that's happening is this is what I'm all about. We're creating a link here. And on a click event method, we're saying send me home. And then it says take me back. That's all it is. So let's save. All right, if I click this, there we go. All right, so that was just a very quick rundown of the Angular 5 router. Really what we cover will help you get by in most instances when it comes to working with the Angular 5 router. Okay, so in the next section, we're going to talk about Angular 5 services. Hey all, Gary Simon from Coursetro. Let's take a look at Angular 5 services. Now, so far we've created two different components, and sometimes you need to access code across multiple components. So instead of creating or rewriting the same code in each component, you can use a service file to share that data. Now, service files are generally used for making HTTP calls or for sharing data between components. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to say we want to take our goals array that we've been working on in the project and share it between both the home and about component. All right, so to get started, we're going to hop over here to our console and we're going to type in ng generate. And what do we want to generate? Well, a service, and we're going to call it data. Of course, you could use nggs data for shorthand syntax. All right, so now let's go ahead and work within this data service file. So it's added just here. And it actually looks pretty similar to a regular component file, except instead of this being designated as a component with a component decorator, it's an injectable with an injectable decorator right here. So one of the best ways to share data between components is to use the RxJS behavior subject library. So we're going to update it to import behavior subject from RxJS behavior subject. All right, next in our class, we're going to say, we're going to create a private property called goals. And this is going to be a new behavior subject of type any. And we're going to set it, the initial value here to the initial goal, and then another silly life goal. Okay. So this is where, from now on, we are actually going to set the default value of that goals array. We'll update the other component later. So then we're going to say, we're going to create another property called goal is equal to this goals from above as observable. Next, we're going to create a custom method, which will be accessible from our other components called change goal. We're going to pass in the actual goal, and this goals.next is goal. And that's it. So before we can actually use this service, we have to import it into the app module file. So we're going to import our data service from data.service, and then we add it to the providers array right here, and then save. So let's go ahead to our home component, and we'll import it at the top, just like that. And then we have to create an instance of it through dependency injection. So the way we do that is in the constructor. We also want to change this. We don't need to set this here anymore. Make that empty. And so we're creating an instance called _data to data service. And then on ng on init, just underneath our item count, we're going to add this data. And now we have access to that goal where we subscribe the response to this.goals equals response. Next, we're also going to say this data change goal, this.goals. And then underneath here, we're going to, in our add item, take this and paste it here. And then also we'll paste that here as well. All right, so every time an item is added or removed, we're going to change and update that goal property. Okay, so let's save this and then we'll go back. I'm going to copy this real quickly because we're also going to import this into the about component because we want access to that goals array as well. So once again, let me go back here. We'll copy this. All right. And then on ng on init, we use this data, goal.subscribe, just as before. Let's also define the goals up here of any. All right. So now let's go to our template. And let's say for some reason we want to use, in our about template, we want to show that goal. So I'll just put in an unordered list, li of ng4, let goal of goals. Basically the same code as before in the other template, and we'll save. So now we can see it's now pulling from that service file the initial goal and another silly life goal. Oh, and by the way, this should be updated as well. I think I forgot to do that. Let's go back real quick. That's in our home component. So the item count needs to be updated to this.goals length. We'll take this, put that right there and save. There we go. Just had an issue of the order. All right. We'll add an item to it. My first life goal. Now if we go to about, there you go. We don't have the styling set up quite right here, but there they are right here. You can also see if we go to home, we click on one, we'll go back here, and now it is updated in this component as well. So that's how you use and share data between different components using a service file. Of course, service files can be used for much more than that in a lot of different use cases, but that's the general gist of how they work. Basically, you create a service file, you import it into your components, and those components will now have access to the properties and the methods that are defined in that service file. All right, so in the next lesson, we're going to conclude this course by taking a look at Angular 5 deployment. Hey everyone, Gary Simon of Coursetro. We're going to wrap everything up by talking about Angular 5 deployment. So in our little project here, which, there's not a ton of functionality, but you really use it to learn quite a bit about Angular 5, we have something that's really simple and it's ready to go. So how do we actually get this live somewhere instead of just being on a local development server? Well, the first thing we have to do is we have to create a build, and you do that through the Angular command line interface tool. So we're going to go back to our console, and we're simply going to run the ng build command. Now this will usually take anywhere between 5 and 20 seconds, and I just want to show you something really important when we're running these build commands. So we can see that I'm going to bring this up over here. It creates a dist folder when you run that command. And inside of here, we have a number of files. And most notably, we could see this vendor.bundle.js, and it's 3.1 megabytes. So if you add all these up, it's close to 3.5 megs just for this build. You don't want to run the build command without the production flag. So we run ng build -- prod. And you're going to see the massive difference in terms of the file sizes. And that's because when you add production, it runs a number of different optimizations, which makes the app significantly smaller and faster. And just this command takes a little bit more time, by the way, just to run, because it's doing more things behind the scene. But we'll see, let's say bring up this. It removes that dist folder initially, and then it will add it back, okay? And now we'll see, look at that. The biggest file now is only 352 megs. This one's 60. So really, there's about an 89% reduction for this particular project when you're running the production. So at this point, now that we have a distribution created for our app, now we can deploy it. So if your app doesn't have or doesn't rely on any type of backend server, which is our case, then you have a number of options. You can take all the files here in this dist folder, like these right here, and you can simply upload them to a server. But just note, if you're uploading them to a subfolder, like your.com/whatever, then you need to run the following build command. You would run ng build production, and then we use the base href, and right in here is where the URL goes. So that's very important, otherwise it won't be able to find the files correctly for it to run properly. Now, another really quick way of deploying your app is through what's called GitHub Pages. So there's a CLI tool, command line interface tool, that you can use that will help you with that. So we're going to put in npm install -g for global angular -cli-gh pages. So if you hit enter, that will save or install on your computer. I already have it installed, so I don't need to run it. And you're also going to need Git, and you can download that right here. And what you want to do is set up a GitHub repo. So to do that, simply create a GitHub account, create a new repo. We're going to call this ng5, create repo right here. And it tells you the steps of what you need to do. We don't have to run git init or git add readme. Let's just come over here and I'll show you those steps real quick. Git add all, git commit, first commit, and then git remote add. Actually, we just paste this line right here. All right, and then finally git push u origin master. You'll see if I refresh this, our project now shows up. And then we also have to rerun our ng build command, because the GitHub Pages is actually a subfolder. So ng build production base href equals https. This is going to be your username right here. Mine is design course on GitHub, github.io / and then the repo name, and mine is ng5. So we'll run that. All right, and once that's done, we simply run angular CLI gh pages. If it's successful, we'll see that it says momentarily, yep, successfully published. So now we can access it at that URL. So now I'll just type in design course and github.io, and this will be ng5. There we go. And now you can even visit this in your own browser and we will have our app. All right, so hopefully you learned a lot about, quickly deploying your app. Of course, you may have other interests like deploying your app to AWS or Heroku, Azure. There's several others, but right now I'm not going to cover that just because I wanted this course to be real succinct and simple and short. All right, so always you can use Google to find those things as well. I did it myself. So I hope you learned quite a bit throughout this course. I definitely check out my site, my Udemy profile, subscribe to my YouTube channel, etc., because I am pumping out content, especially regarding Angular, being that Angular 5 just released, left and right. All right, I'm Gary Simon. I'll talk to you later.